When World War I ended, the world learned about the treaties of Versailles and Brest-Litovsk. But what nobody saw were the secret plans that each major power had designed to completely redraw the map of Europe. Plans so radical they would have changed history forever. In this video, you'll discover the hidden ambitions of Germany, France, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain, and why none of them managed to pull it off.
In 1918, World War I came to an end with a decisive victory for the Entente powers. What followed was a series of agreements that would redefine the map of Europe. The following year, the victors imposed treaties on the defeated Central Powers. The most famous of these was the Treaty of Versailles, which stripped Germany of vast territories and forced them to accept full responsibility for the conflict. The peace conference that produced these treaties met in Paris for 6 tense months. Representatives from over 30 nations gathered to decide the fate of the continent. However, the real decisions were made by just 4 men: American President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. These leaders negotiated behind closed doors while the rest of the world waited outside. But here's the thing, there was a historical irony that few people noticed at the time. Just 18 months earlier, Germany had imposed its own peace treaty on Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which the Germans took control of a massive chunk of Eastern Europe. This treaty had been just as draconian as Versailles, maybe even harsher in its terms. The Entente powers denounced it as a perfect example of German barbarism, but then they'd turn around and apply the same punitive logic against Germany. Yet these treaties that were finally signed were barely shadows of what each power had imagined. They were products of the circumstances in which victory was achieved. For the Entente, the treaty reflected a war that had transformed into a crusade for the self-determination of peoples, increasingly dominated by American President Woodrow Wilson's vision. His famous 14 points had promised a new world order based on justice and democracy, not the imperial conquests of the past. For Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was only possible because Russia had started to disintegrate as a coherent state under the weight of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Germans took advantage of the chaos to extract concessions they never would have gotten from a stable Russian government. The reality was unsettling. No Entente power or Central Power actually managed to fulfill their desired peace plans or their complete vision of a post-war world. What the world saw in 1919 was an impoverished, rushed, and contradictory version of the ambitions that each nation had cultivated during 4 years of total war. But to truly understand the magnitude of what was lost, we need to explore the secret plans that each power designed while the war was still raging.
Germany was the main power of the Central Powers, and without a doubt, the nation with the most radical vision for completely restructuring the European order. Throughout the conflict, German objectives fluctuated constantly, often depending on who dominated the government at any given moment. However, there were concrete and extraordinarily ambitious proposals about what concessions Germany demanded as the price of victory. The first and most infamous of these plans was the so-called September Program, conceived in 1914 when it seemed Germany was on track for a quick and crushing victory. This document represented one of the most Carthaginian peace plans imagined by any nation during the entire war. It was drafted by Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg with input from German industrialists, military leaders, and diplomats who saw the war as a unique opportunity to transform Germany into Europe's undisputed power. In the West, Germany planned to annex resource-rich regions of France, particularly the Brie area, famous for its iron deposits that fed French steel industry. This annexation wouldn't just weaken France economically, it would strengthen German industrial capacity for any future conflict. Belgium would be transformed into a German puppet state, giving Berlin control of channel ports to directly threaten Great Britain. The Belgian coast would provide ideal naval bases to challenge British dominance of the North Sea. German Luxembourg would be completely absorbed, eliminating even the fiction of its independence. German planners also considered the possibility of a customs union that would economically link France to Germany, turning it into a captive market for German products. France would lose its economic independence without formally losing its political sovereignty, a sophisticated form of imperial domination. But the most striking thing about the September program was its remarkable similarity in the East to the lands Germany would actually take almost 4 years later in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This reflects a crucial fact. For German diplomats, the main war was always in the East, where the greatest spoils lay in terms of resource-rich lands. Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, these were the jewels Germany coveted above all else. These regions didn't just offer vast agricultural and mineral resources, but millions of workers who could be exploited to strengthen the German economy. The plan envisioned creating German puppet states all along Russia's western border. These territories would provide Germany with vital resources, captive markets, and a buffer zone against any future Russian resurgence. The Germans imagined transferring German population to these regions to gradually Germanize them, creating a belt of ethnic loyalty that would ensure German control for generations. However, the September program was never implemented in the West, and German plans had to adapt to a very different reality.
The September program became obsolete when German armies were defeated at the Battle of the Marne. The subsequent descent into trench warfare meant German diplomats started seeing a favorable negotiated peace rather than total victory as the main goal of the German war effort. The German chancellor until 1917, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, offered what seemed like more reasonable proposals. Bethmann wasn't a pacifist by any means, but he was one of the more clear-headed German politicians and understood that Germany would have to give ground on some issues to achieve peace. He recognized that a peace that was too harsh would be impossible to maintain and would plant the seeds of future conflicts. Although he never offered a definitive series of proposals regarding Western Europe, he imagined small border corrections with the annexation of Brie and Luxembourg. The terms discussed with the Belgian king in a separate peace proposal in 1916 included the demilitarization of Belgium and its economic dependence on Germany, turning it into a permanent satellite. Bethmann hoped King Albert could be persuaded to accept these terms in exchange for keeping his throne and preserving Belgium's formal existence as an independent state. In the East, his ambitions weren't as expansionist as those outlined in the September program, but he still aimed to declare Poland and Lithuania as independent states under German influence. These states would provide strategic security against Russia without the administrative and political costs of direct annexation. Even so, Bethmann considered at various moments a separate and lenient peace with Russia so he could concentrate on the West, recognizing that Germany couldn't win a two-front war indefinitely. Bethmann was finally removed in 1917, so he never really got to seriously attempt to negotiate an agreement. His fall marked the rise of even more radical elements in the German government, particularly the Third High Command military leadership that saw any compromise as betrayal. But Bethmann's proposals would seem almost sensible compared to the plans of other German leaders who dreamed of something far grander. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how war ambitions can transform from rational plans into imperial fantasies, because what comes next reveals the most delusional proposals that emerged from the German high command. While Bethmann tried to navigate political reality, other German leaders developed even more extreme visions of the future. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who'd been instrumental in creating the German high seas fleet before the war, never really got close to the levers of diplomatic power. However, his plans are fascinating because of how completely delusional they were. Tirpitz saw the war not as a struggle for European supremacy, but as a battle for world domination. So he believed the British Empire and its command of sea routes was the main enemy. To defeat Britain, he advocated signing a white peace with Russia in the east and concentrating completely on the Western Front. In his vision, Germany and Russia had no fundamental conflicts and could coexist peacefully while Germany destroyed British maritime power. His plan contemplated the annexation of all channel ports to prepare for the next war, which would be a final showdown against the British Empire. In Tirpitz's mind, World War I was just the prelude to an even greater conflict for control of the world's oceans. He imagined a second war, probably in the 1930s or 40s, where a Germany with access to Atlantic ports would finally defeat the Royal Navy and break the blockade strangling the German economy. Finally, there was the plan of the Third High Command, dominated by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. This plan materialized after peace was made with Russia in March 1918. Ludendorff saw Russia's defeat only as a prelude to total victory in the West. With millions of soldiers freed from the Eastern Front, the Germans launched a massive spring offensive in 1918, confident they could break Allied lines before American troops arrived in force. Although there were never concrete proposals put in writing, we can assume they would have been similar to the original September program. Massive annexations in France, total control of Belgium, and the creation of a German empire stretching from the English Channel to the Urals. Ludendorff was a German supremacist who fervently believed in Germany's destiny to dominate Europe. Almost all these plans came with the proposal of a German-led economic union with the rest of Europe, which would provide a captive market for German goods and exclude Britain. Generally known as Mitteleuropa, based on a book written in 1915, this idea was never an authoritative policy statement, but it reflected the dominant thinking. The vision was a unified continental Europe under German hegemony, functioning as a counterweight to the British Empire and the growing power of the United States. The common theme in all these plans was unsettling. This wasn't a war of survival for Germany. Even the supposedly compromised peace plans aimed to ensure Germany would be supreme on the continent for the foreseeable future. The Germans weren't fighting to preserve their existence. They were fighting to establish permanent domination that would make them the undisputed hegemonic power of Europe. But Germany wasn't the only power with radical ambitions. Every nation at war had developed its own vision of the post-war world, and these visions would clash in devastating ways. Of all the combatants in World War I, France had the clearest and most singular war aim: the recovery of Alsace-Lorraine. This territory had been amputated from France in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, and the desire to recover it had fueled revanchist sentiment in the country ever since. For the French, these lost provinces had become a national symbol of humiliation that had to be corrected. The territory was so vital that despite the fact German armies occupied deep French territory for most of the war, French diplomats almost totally refused to contemplate any negotiated peace that didn't include Alsace-Lorraine. This was non-negotiable. Even the most moderate French insisted this was the absolute red line. Without Alsace-Lorraine, no peace was possible. France was also motivated more than any other nation by hostility toward Germany, which had replaced France as Europe's preeminent power in 1871. Consequently, French war aims also formed around finding ways to permanently limit German power. The French bitterly remembered how Germany had defeated them in just 6 weeks in 1870, and they were determined this would never happen again. These proposals ranged from the hardest line positions, which advocated for the complete balkanization of Germany into multiple small states, as had existed before 1871, to the comparatively moderate position that the imbalance between Germany and France had to be corrected. One way to achieve this was by annexing more German territory. The French maintained throughout much of the war designs on the coal-rich Saar region, which would be annexed to increase French industrial strength and compensate for the destruction of French mines during the German occupation. More extensive plans advocated establishing a separate Rhineland state to provide security for France. This buffer state would separate France from Germany proper and eliminate the threat of another German invasion across the Franco-German border. In the early days of the war, the French military even considered recreating France's natural borders by annexing the entire left bank of the Rhine, an ambition dating back to the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte. Some French strategists even proposed dividing Germany into its historical components: Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and other independent states. This would reverse German unification and restore the balance of power that had existed before 1871, when France was the dominant power on the continent.
Russia, meanwhile, was a nation in perpetual crisis of self-confidence about why the war was really being fought. The initial casus belli had been to defend the Slavic brother state of Serbia from annihilation, but as the body count started piling up, this wasn't a particularly sellable point to the Russian public. Russian peasants didn't understand why they should die for Serbia, a country most couldn't even locate on a map. When Russia entered the war, Supreme Commander Nikolai Nikolaevich published a manifesto promising the creation of a Polish state within the Russian Empire. The objective was to achieve this by uniting Congress Poland with the German and Austrian Polish regions. This would serve the broader Russian objective of weakening Germany and destroying Austria as a competitor in the Balkans. A unified Poland under Russian protection would provide millions of additional subjects and extend Russian territory deep into Central Europe. However, the Russians never went so far as to specify the complete destruction of the Habsburgs, for fear that the collapse of this multi-ethnic empire would encourage Russia's own minorities to rebel. The Russian Empire itself was a fragile multi-ethnic structure, and Russian strategists feared that Austria-Hungary's disintegration would create a dangerous precedent that could be applied to the Tsarist Empire itself. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov was able to extract a commitment from Britain and France that Russia would take Constantinople at the end of the war. Formerly the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, of which Russia claimed to be the successor, the city would finally give Russia access to the Mediterranean. This was an objective that Tsars had pursued for centuries. Control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits would allow the Russian Black Sea Fleet to operate freely in the Mediterranean, transforming Russia into a genuine naval power.
The Russians also contemplated annexing significant parts of the Ottoman Empire in the Caucasus and possibly Armenia. These conquests would expand Russian territory southward and establish a Russian zone of influence in the Middle East, rivaling British and French ambitions in the region. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, had objectives that had provoked the conflict in 1914. For a decade, this multi-ethnic empire was plagued by instability in its Slavic areas due to a resurgent Serbian state that aimed to unify with these regions. Serbian nationalism threatened to tear the empire apart from within by inspiring South Slavs within Austria-Hungary to seek unification with Serbia. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by the Serbian Black Hand organization, the Austrians saw it as an opportunity to crush the Serbs once and for all. Bizarrely enough, the Austrians didn't actually intend to annex any part of Serbia. They already had too many Slavs, and more would have set the delicate balance within the Habsburg Empire. Austrian strategists feared that adding more Slavs would make Slavs the largest ethnic group in the empire, which could lead to demands for a third Slavic kingdom alongside Austria and Hungary. Instead, they intended to make sure Serbia would never again challenge Austria. They do this by partitioning Serbia between Bulgaria and Greece, then turning the resulting state into a vassal completely dependent on Vienna. Montenegro would have its coast taken away to truly box in the Serbs and eliminate any independent access to the Adriatic Sea. The Austrians also contemplated expansion to the south at the expense of Italy, their nominal ally that had remained neutral when war broke out. Austria saw the opportunity to annex additional Italian territory in the north and consolidate its control of the Adriatic, transforming that sea into an Austrian lake. While these powers pursued their contradictory dreams of domination, a question started to emerge. Could any of these nations actually compromise enough to end the war? Smash that subscribe button if these war plans are blowing your mind, because the most shocking truth about how these ambitions led to total disaster hasn't dropped yet.
Britain had entered the war without territorial ambitions in Europe, and this remained consistent throughout the conflict. Its main casus belli had been the German invasion of Belgium, and Belgian independence remained Britain's primary demand throughout the war.
The British had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in treaties dating back to the 19th century, and they believed national honor demanded they defend that guarantee. For Britain, the destruction of the German High Seas Fleet, which challenged Royal Navy dominance in the North Sea, was also a crucial objective. These were, in general, what Britain focused on, but the secondary objective was maintaining a balance of power in Europe. In practice, this meant restricting German expansion. The British had followed this policy for centuries: never allow a single power to dominate the European continent. To achieve this, they linked other allies' war aims, like French demands for Alsace-Lorraine, to their own, seeing it as a way to weaken Germany. This doesn't mean Britain had no territorial objectives of its own. Once the Ottomans entered the war, the Middle East in particular became an area of interest for Britain. The British saw the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire as an opportunity to secure routes to India and establish control over oil lands that were becoming increasingly vital for the Royal Navy. This region was divided up in a treaty known as Sykes-Picot, which gave Britain influence over vast regions of the former Ottoman Empire. Despite this, of all the belligerents, British war aims were the most flexible. The British were willing to moderate their demands if it meant reaching a negotiated peace that preserved the balance of power. But here's the devastating truth no power wanted to face. As the war continued, war aims didn't necessarily become harder. The September program of 1914 was as draconian as anything Germany would have proposed in 1918. The initial ambitions of each power remained remarkably consistent throughout the conflict.
What's more shocking is the growing intransigence of all belligerents to avoid reaching an agreement. Each nation had committed so deeply to its war aims that backing down would mean admitting that hundreds of thousands of their citizens had died in vain. Politicians faced the wrath of their own people if they returned without the promised victories. Generals who'd sent millions to their deaths couldn't accept that those deaths had served no purpose. The Germans rejected any peace that wouldn't give them continental supremacy. For them, a peace without significant territorial gains would equal defeat, something unthinkable after 4 years of total sacrifice. The French refused to contemplate an agreement without Alsace-Lorraine. French politicians knew they'd be overthrown by the mob if they accepted any peace that left those provinces in German hands. The Russians wouldn't give up on Constantinople until the revolution knocked them completely out of the war. The Austrians wouldn't allow Serbia to survive as a threat, though this only guaranteed Serbia would emerge stronger than ever from the Habsburg Empire's ashes. The British wouldn't tolerate a dominant Germany, though their insistence on total victory helped create conditions for the next war. There were several attempts at negotiated peace that failed precisely because of this intransigence. In 1916, American President Woodrow Wilson attempted to mediate a peace without annexations. It was rejected by all powers because nobody was willing to accept the status quo antebellum after so much bloodshed. In 1917, Pope Benedict XV proposed a peace based on territorial restoration and international arbitration. Again, all parties rejected it. And so, while political leaders failed to find a compromise to the crisis of 1914, they also failed to find one that could have ended the war before it destroyed everything.
Britain had entered the war without territorial ambitions in Europe, and this remained consistent throughout the conflict. Its main casus belli had been the German invasion of Belgium, and Belgian independence remained Britain's primary demand throughout the war. The British had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in treaties dating back to the 19th century, and they believed national honor demanded they defend that guarantee. For Britain, the destruction of the German High Seas Fleet, which challenged Royal Navy dominance in the North Sea, was also a crucial objective. These were, in general, what Britain focused on, but the secondary objective was maintaining a balance of power in Europe. In practice, this meant restricting German expansion. The British had followed this policy for centuries, never allow a single power to dominate the European continent. To achieve this, they linked other allies' war aims, like French demands for Alsace-Lorraine, to their own, seeing it as a way to weaken Germany. This doesn't mean Britain had no territorial objectives of its own. Once the Ottomans entered the war, the Middle East in particular became an area of interest for Britain. The British saw the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire as an opportunity to secure routes to India and establish control over oil lands that were becoming increasingly vital for the Royal Navy. This region was divided up in a treaty known as Sykes-Picot, which gave Britain influence over vast regions of the former Ottoman Empire. Despite this, of all the belligerents, British war aims were the most flexible. The British were willing to moderate their demands if it meant reaching a negotiated peace that preserved the balance of power. But here's the devastating truth no power wanted to face. As the war continued, war aims didn't necessarily become harder. The September program of 1914 was as draconian as anything Germany would have proposed in 1918. The initial ambitions of each power remained remarkably consistent throughout the conflict. One theme emerges with devastating clarity from this examination of war aims. The political leaders of all the great powers failed not once, but twice catastrophically. First, they failed to find a compromise to the 1914 crisis that could have prevented the war entirely. Then, they failed to find one that could have ended the war before it consumed an entire generation. Each power entered the war with objectives it considered vital. But as the conflict continued, these objectives became not just national policies, but sacred symbols for which millions had died. Yielding on Alsace-Lorraine, on Belgium, on Serbia, on Constantinople would mean admitting all the suffering had been in vain. Politicians who suggested compromise faced accusations of treason, of dishonoring the memory of the fallen. And so the powers kept fighting, each clinging to visions of a post-war world that would never materialize. The Germans dreamed of Mittel Europa, the French of a fractured Germany, the Russians of Constantinople, the Austrians of Serbia's destruction, the British of the balance of power. Each vision was incompatible with the others, and no power was willing to give enough ground to reach a mutually acceptable agreement. In the end, the world that emerged from Versailles wasn't anybody's vision. It was a hasty, contradictory compromise that fully satisfied no power and planted the seeds for the next conflict. The peace treaties weren't triumphant conclusions of carefully planned war aims. They were admissions of mutual exhaustion. Germany felt betrayed and humiliated. France felt insecure despite victory. Britain discovered it had won the war but lost its dominant position. Russia had collapsed into revolution. Austria had ceased to exist. Historians have debated for a century whether the war could have been ended earlier through a negotiated peace. The evidence suggests opportunities existed, particularly in 1916 and 1917, when all powers were exhausted, but before the United States entered the conflict. However, the intransigence of political leaders, pressure from military leaders demanding total victory, and the weight of war propaganda that had demonized the enemy made any meaningful compromise impossible. Perhaps the most bitter lesson from World War I's war aims is this: when political leaders refuse to compromise, when every concession is seen as betrayal of the fallen, when war aims become more sacred than peace itself, the result isn't the glorious victory each nation imagined, it's total exhaustion, the destruction of empires, and the creation of conditions that guarantee the slaughter will begin again. The secret plans of Germany, France, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain reveal an uncomfortable truth. World War I didn't end because some nation achieved its war aims. It ended because all powers, victorious and defeated alike, could no longer continue fighting. And in that mutual exhaustion, they created a world nobody had wanted, and that would contain the seeds of an even more destructive conflict. Just 21 years later, many of the same disputed territories would become battlefields again when World War II proved that none of the lessons from the Great War had been learned. Hit that subscribe button if this video changed your perspective on how war ambitions can transform into diplomatic nightmares, because every week we break down the historical moments that show how political intransigence can destroy entire empires and nations.